Spring was in full bloom by the final day of May 1310, just north of Notre Dame Cathedral, completed only about 50 years prior, at least as much as such structures are ever really completed. Men were piling bundles of wood around a central stake. Somewhere in a nearby dungeon, a condemned woman sat in serene silence, not feverishly praying, not begging for a reprieve, not arguing her case before the Inquisition, but eyes closed, somewhere between being more awake and in complete repose, drowned in an abyss of light. She had been completely silent since she and her companion were arrested a year and a half prior. She was silent when the Inquisition demanded her cooperation with her own murder, and she had been silent when she had been condemned as a relapsed heretic and a pseudo-mulier, a fake woman. She had written about the annihilation of the soul in love, about how divine goodness could come to fill a vessel in the vacuity of absolute wretchedness, and that having become so filled with the divine that the simple annihilated soul would have no need of external virtue, external ritual, or even an external church. She had become the void in which the divine beheld divinity itself. Indeed, she had written about how the soul passed through 7 distinct stages in the process of individual annihilation and mystical union with divine love, and how the passage from the 6th to the 7th could only come to pass when the soul was separated from the body for once and for all, at least in the form of physical death. And on June the 1st, 1310, the Inquisition incinerated the living flesh of the mystic Marguerite Porete. Rather than the jeering that we normally associate with these executions, those in attendance were simply brought to tears, silent tears, at her final moments of transcendent piety. Her body burned, her ashes were probably discarded like trash into the river Seine, and yet her mystical piety survived. Her book, A Guide for Mystical Annihilation, went underground, and it thrived in several languages and in the mystical theology of titans like Meister Eckhart. And in 1946, a brilliant scholar identified otherwise anonymous mystical medieval manuscripts as nothing less than the lost voice of Marguerite Porete. And now the spiritual voice the Inquisition sought to silence through fiery extermination speaks, teaches, and sings again the path to union with divine love. Let's explore the mystical teachings of the martyr and beguine Marguerite Porete. Make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica for weekly explorations of topics in esoteric history. And if you'd like to support this work of providing evidence-backed, free, and accessible content like this, I'd hope you consider supporting me via my Patreon or picking up a bit of the merch we have for offer here on the channel. If you're new to the study of esotericism and you want to get the lay of the land, make sure to check out my study guide, which will orient you to the very fields of this school and get some reliable texts on it. And if you're interested in actual historical books on topics in the occult and the esoteric, make sure to check out my bookstore, Esoterica Rare Books. You can find all of those links in the description and in the pinned comment below. But now, let's turn to the path of spiritual annihilation and divine love as taught by the mystical martyr and beguine Marguerite Porete. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. Like other mystic women from this period, we know little else about Marguerite Porete aside from the records which detail her arrest, her prosecution, and eventually, in this case, her murder. She seems to have emerged from the Eno region, apparently was of noble birth, as evidenced by her knowledge of the courtly culture and the love poetry of that world. Further, she did seem to have some theological training, as her writings revealed an especially detailed knowledge of Trinitarian economics, that is to say, the way that medieval scholars thought of the Trinity interacting with itself, specifically in the tradition of Augustine. However, when she put pen to parchment, she apparently did so in the vernacular French of her time, a pretty dangerous decision for such a daring mystical theology. Porete apparently belonged to the emergent movement of devout laity known as the Beguines. Now, I've done a whole episode on the Beguines. If you're not familiar with this movement, you can check out that in the pinned comment below for more information on this incredibly important movement in the Middle Ages. But in a short summary, the Beguines were pious women who took religious vows such as chastity, poverty, and service to the community, but did not enter religious orders or did not become enclosed as nuns. They supported themselves both through begging alms, but also through things like cottage industry, often becoming the most frightening thing imaginable to most men, medieval or otherwise, an autonomous community of powerfully independent women. This independence afforded them the ability to write and express their own spiritual journeys, often in their own languages, and Beguine spirituality represents some of the most sophisticated and indeed most profound mystical expressions of Christianity, simply put, whether it's medieval or otherwise. So much so that the greatest scholar of Christian mysticism of the 20th century, maybe just one of the greatest scholars of Christian mysticism, period, Bernard McGim, has suggested that 3 of these Beguines, Heidewig of Antwerp, Mechtild of Magdeburg, and Marguerite Porete, along with 1 Franciscan nun, Angeli of Foligno, represent 4 novel apostles bearing 4 novel gospels whose experience of the divine utterly transformed Western mysticism, Christian or otherwise. I'm pretty personally moved by this argument, and this episode on Marguerite Porete brings to a conclusion to my series covering all 4 women. So if you've not checked out my episode on Heidewig, Mechtild, Angela Foligno, and of course this episode on Marguerite Porete, make sure to check out all the other episodes as well. But Marguerite Porete's fate must be understood in the specific secular and religious politics of her time. And the first consideration is the Beguine movement itself. And despite some initial enthusiastic support in France, which was uncommon, it was often treated with profound skepticism. And this skepticism grew to disdain and then to downright hatred, insofar as those Beguine communities were not very closely tied to already accepted religious orders, especially given that the church had officially forbidden any new religious orders to be founded. Thus, Beguines relied on the protection of being attached to other orders, especially the mendicant orders, especially the Franciscans, to basically vouch for their orthodoxy. This placed Beguines who chose a more itinerant life serving communities afoot in very grave danger of being picked off one by one as anti-Beguine sentiment erupted by the early 14th century. Porete for herself actually mentions being persecuted by apparently partially enclosed Beguines, and she seems to have been just such an itinerant Beguine herself. Secondly, the Inquisition was very much off to the races by the 14th century, having cut their teeth on the anti-Cathar and anti-Waldensian crusades of the 13th century. The Inquisition was now hyper-focused on the threat of heresy, especially in France under Philip IV. And with the rise in mystical theology, especially again under the Beguines, the more extreme elements of those mystical theologies, especially when those extreme mystical theologies were put into books and then actively distributed by those Beguines, you can imagine immediately caught the eye of the Inquisition. Now, those more extreme mystical elements, often taken out of context from these kinds of books, especially those that argued for antinomian or extra-ecclesiastical means of salvation, would eventually be grouped together as a so-called heresy of the free spirit. And while one might rightly wonder to what degree the movement of this so-called organized heresy really existed at all, some elements seem to have been built up by, even if just in the minds of the Inquisition, they do begin to appear in this period, including those of, well, writings like Marguerite Porete. Indeed, Porete would be the first Western mystic to be put to death precisely for mystical heresy. The first, though sadly not the last, in the history of Western Christendom. Finally, the King of France, Philip IV, the Fair, deeply in debt to both Jewish silver minters and Templar bankers, sought the easiest means to deal with one's creditors. Exile them, confiscate their property, and then murder the rest of them under the pretense of deracinating heresy. One wonders what you could do with the student loan people. Thus, we have to understand that the judicial murder of Marguerite Porete is probably something of a footnote to the larger ongoing suppression of especially the Templars, with over 50 Templars being burned to death on the 12th of May, 1310, just a couple of weeks prior to her own incineration. Nevertheless, Marguerite Porete seems to have entered history only between sometime around 1296 and 1306, when her book was condemned by Guy II, the Bishop of Cambrai, and burned in front of her. She was apparently forbade from further distributing it, but she was apparently set free, though I can't imagine she wasn't subjected to some form of inquisitorial punishment. That book, with its full title, The Mirror of the Simple Souls Who Are Annihilated and Remain Only in Will and Desire of Love, was apparently composed over some time. One can actually take note of the evolution of Porete's thinking within its pages, so it's hard to know what's exactly early and what's exactly late. Was apparently composed in the vernacular French of her time. Though, as I mentioned, we basically know nothing about Porete's life, when or at what age she composed the text, or even her age at the time of her execution. The book itself is composed of about 140 or so chapters of varying length and of a highly episodic nature, as one might imagine of a mystical guide which argues that reason alone can only guide one so far. The text doesn't so much follow a logical progression or a scholastic mode of argumentation. The text survived in 3 old French manuscripts, 2 of which are now lost, 6 Latin manuscripts, an Italian translation based on one of those Latin manuscripts, and an edition in Middle English, which served as a further grounds for yet another Latin translation. In other words, it survives in some 6 different versions in 4 different languages, testifying to the enduring power and popularity of this text. And of course, it would go on to influence the likes of people like Meister Eckhart. Perhaps after the burning of the first book, Porete sought out ecclesiastical authorities to vouch for the orthodoxy of its teaching, and indeed those approbations were still included in the explicit of some of the surviving versions. Nevertheless, Porete and her companion Bechard were arrested in 1308, now under the orders of the Dominican Inquisitor William of Paris, and he would convene several different inquisitorial panels to review the pair, their alleged heresies, along with the specific theological contents of the mirror. The first of those occurred on April the 3rd, the second on April the 9th, and then another in May to condemn the two to their respective fates. However, through at least the first panel, it seems that neither Porete nor Guillard actually acknowledged the authority of the Inquisition in the least. Porete refused to even appear before the body, she refused to make oaths, and she refused to respond to their questioning. The inquisitorial panel ultimately declared her contumacious and placed her under major excommunication while keeping her imprisoned. Now, I don't have to say that inquisitorial prisons were awful, but you can imagine. The second panel's consultation would eventually elicit a confession from Guillard before eventually he would earn the mercy of life imprisonment in said inquisitorial prison after he confessed. However, on April 11th, William of Paris would gather 22 theologians to examine Porete's mirror, from which they derived 15 articles of suspected heresy. Of those 15, only 3 have come down to us, and I'm going to examine each of them in turn as we work through the mirror itself in just a moment. However, the fact that William needed 22 theologians to declare the work heretical suggests to me and to other scholars that they were really on a kind of fishing expedition. The task was to find heresy regardless of whether or not it was there in the mirror at all. Again, recall that the text had already been burned as heretical some years prior, and Porete would again face the tribunal on May 9th, and she remained as stalwart and as stoic as ever, refusing to give oaths, much less answer questions. She just, at some level, refused, rightly I would say, to be complicit in her own murder. Indeed, I actually suspect something much deeper, much theologically deeper is going on in her silence and detachment that I'll discuss toward the end of the video. Regardless, her book was found to be full of heresies and errors, and on May 31st, her companion was sent to prison for life, and the Begin, Marguerite Porete, would burn the following day. Mocked as a pseudo-mulier, a fake woman, a phony woman, probably for acting in a way unbecoming of the expectations of women of her time. We don't even know, it's horrible to say, but we don't even know if she was given the typical mercy of strangulation before the fires annihilated her body. A soul that I think at that point had long since been annihilated in the abyss of divine love. The mirror of simple souls who are annihilated and remain only in will and desire of love is, well, the perfect title for Porete's book, and the kind of book titles we need to bring back. The Mirror itself is a kind of dialogical textbook primarily featuring a three-way conversation between the soul, often seemingly in Porete's voice, though I suspect we're supposed to interpolate our own into that mix, Reason, who is often both the helpmate and the opponent of soul, and of course divine love, which is effectively God. Insofar as the Gospel of John, God is love. However, these conversations are highly episodic with brief, bewildering sparks followed by much longer expository passages. And of course, this is part of the episode where I have to warn you that, the text is highly resistant to summary because, well, it's a sort of staccato revelation of the mystical journey. Here we're goaded, warned, welcomed, we're given signposts, we're provided with analysis, but most of all, and we're brought into the cycle, into the process by which mystical annihilation in love is the sought-for outcome. It is a teacher for the aspirant, but also a kind of vade mecum for the very experienced mystic. Thus, one comes to the text in media res, always one's soul always already caught up between reason and love. However, what's missing is also surprising about the mirror. Christ himself rarely ever makes an appearance. The erotic bridegroom mysticism of other Begins like Heretic is basically silent, though Porete's language of love is very surely and powerfully charged. We're basically never told about anything like mystical visions. Even the text is hostile to such visions. Finally, Porete doesn't even engage in the classical mystical subversion typically of her Begins, whereby her authority rests upon God using the weak, that is to say women, to cast down the strong, that is to say the men, or the rational scholastics by the irrational mystics or something. Indeed, as many have pointed out, Porete never apologizes for being a woman. She never makes her femininity something which needs to be explained away, or she never seeks to make herself male-like to gain social respectability in the text. The mystical process she's describing is purely spiritual, not taken up with earthly gender or sexuality, and thus she speaks to the male and the female reader equally. She normalizes the relationship between both at a spiritual register. Hence her foregoing the normal self-deprecation and disclaimer for her gender, otherwise so typical for her time, so that, she can get right down to the point. The goal of union with the divine, regardless of one's social status or gender or what have you. Hence, I suspect her being referred to as a pseudo-mulier, a fake woman in the eyes of the Inquisition, because she wasn't a woman in the way they recognized. She was a woman who indeed knew her place, united with the divine and soaring above the petty tyrants of the Inquisition and the logic-chopping chatter of scholastic clerics. But taken together, what we have in the mirror is something of a phenomenological analytic of the mystical itinerary by which the soul can achieve annihilation. and become united with the divine. However, to appreciate and to more deeply understand that mystical goal, it's just necessary to get some sort of handle on some of the more difficult underlying mechanisms at work in Porete's thought, specifically her theory of the spiritual faculties and her spiritual anthropology more generally, her sevenfold mystical itinerary of the soul, along with the 3 or 4 deaths, depending on how you count them, along with her understanding of the process of mystical annihilation of the soul and its union with the divine in love. But to unfold all of this entire process, it's going to be necessary to work through each of these elements together, weaving them together as we go to sort of show the mystical process as one totality. But as I noted earlier on, Porete assumes a pretty courtly and frankly elitist view of religion, such that the true seeker is simply spiritually superior than the peasant believer. That's her language, not mine. Thus, the very first stage of her spiritual itinerary assumes a life in which the believer's soul has already been touched by divine grace, such that the desire for mortal sin has been lifted in its entirety, and that they are already fully living in the commandment to love their neighbors as themselves and to love God with their whole heart. Yeah, that's her first stage, and that's the first death, the death to sin. Thus, the fundamentals of Christian salvation are already just her first stage. Thus, her mystical itinerary isn't for anyone looking for salvation. It's for one already saved looking for a radical, intimate experience of the divine as part of an elite form of mystical, vital vocation. And this introduces us to one of her most important theological and religious anthropological distinctions. Of those that receive salvation, there are 2 types, the lost soul and the sad soul. The lost soul receives salvation as merely content with that salvation. They're saved, that's enough. Again, they've achieved salvation, but this is just sort of where it stops for them. They're free from mortal sin. They don't want to kill anybody or assault anybody. And they abide in confession when they commit minor sins, and through the elements of the sacraments, they are content to pass their life away, waiting for final glorification after death. It's something like being akin to being healed of a fatal disease, I suppose, only to go back to basically living the way that you were before. In Porete's language, these are spiritual peasants. However, the sad soul is aware of a deeper lack. Mere salvation isn't enough. It's akin to a person healed of that same disease, but now they want to go on to live life to its fullest degree possible. They almost died, and now they want to live a more full life than ever before. The difference between the lost and the sad soul are about the dynamics within the soul itself. Porete understands the soul as pure ability or activity which generates intellect, which perceives reality. Understanding flows from both ability and intellect, forming a Trinitarian structure within the soul expressive of the divine Trinitarian ground of the soul itself. The intellect is able to interact with 3 different categories of reality: the world of things, or the world of creation, which allows them in turn to grasp higher order truths, which can then eventually propel them to an understanding of divine things. The lost soul is content with what appears before them, allowing the church to basically do its job of mediating their salvation via the sacraments. They can and they do will to do the good, but they do not do so out of reason. They are simply following the dictates of another will, the holy will, admittedly, of the Mother Church. For the lost soul, salvation is obtained in a kind of closed loop, them letting the church basically sort out all that complicated theology and all things divine. The sad soul, however, is more aware that they are lacking something. And indeed, in this sadness is wisdom, a la Ecclesiastes. The sad soul's intellect knows, indeed grasps, the reality of some missing element in their relationship with the divine. And deploying both their will and reason, they lean into that sense of lack, their desire for a why, of virtue via reason, and they press their own wills even more strongly into the evangelical mandate of the teachings of Christ. And this inaugurates the second stage of the mystical ascent, pressing the will via reason deeper into the mortification of the worldly, beyond merely being lost in the true reality of sadness, dejection, and alienation, actually embracing that sadness, that dejection, and that alienation, that loss, that lack. The third stage, like many aspects of Porete's thoughts, is actually marked by a kind of contradiction. On the one hand, the aspirant more deeply than ever seeks out via reason the path to virtue, which redoubles one's own alienation. If mere human goodness is so difficult to achieve, then how much further is one from true divine goodness? But all the while, one is relishing in deepening one's virtue, one's love to one's neighbor through service and kindness, and of course, love. The deeper one experiences and extends that eternal, external love, the deeper one feels alienated from the source of that very love. Knowing how deeply you're loving shows you how different and how weak your love is compared to divine love. This deepening of the will to love, but also the experience of alienation from its source, is the third stage. In the fourth stage, one simply becomes intoxicated with love itself, love for its own sake. Here, the why of the virtues is abandoned. One learns to live without a why, as she has it. Here, love is pressed by will to its simple human summit. One is simply and utterly inebriated with love. And for the classical mystical tradition of Augustine and Bernard of Clairvaux, this is generally taken to be the apex of the human mystical experience. To be awash in divine love, to experience being utterly loved by God, and to extend that love to others with no preconditions whatsoever. But Porete warns us to think that the mystical journey ends here would be a mistake. Indeed, she even suggests that the lost soul may even reach this height in certain key moments, that the sad soul may ultimately reach this level, but then despair of anything higher than such ecstatic experiences of love. However, intellect can drive the soul even further through an examination of the interior world of the will. The fifth stage occurs in the inner recesses of the human will and inaugurates spiritual death. Intellect reveals that the will that wills love remains alien to the divine, and yet the source of one's will can be nothing other than the divine, for the divine is all that truly is, the source of being itself, the ground of being itself. Thus, the truest act of will would be to surrender of one's own will back to the reality of all willing itself, to the divine will. This is the free offering of the free will, the very will that individuates us as beings at all. Thus, in this stage, the very will which loved and was loved is surrendered back to the primal divine will. Indeed, with the foregoing of the will, reason, too, must perish. It has led the soul home, but it cannot join her, as reason requires a distinction between thinker and thought, a distinction which, like all distinctions between subject and object, well, they're all gonna collapse pretty soon. In the free transference of the will, the soul becomes increasingly emptied out, aware of its own wretchedness, its own nothingness. For there is nothing that is truly other than the divine. And this inward wretchedness sinks the soul into the abyss of humility, into the abyss of nothingness, shrinking the contents of the soul into oblivion, an oblivion devoid of even reason, intellect, and will. And in the final act of spiritual death, the will itself, along with any sense of even dialectical love, one understanding a distinction between lover, love, and beloved, perishes into the utter abyss of no-thingness. Now, the concept of the nothing is complex in Porete's thought, and it's worth a short detour here. In one sense, God is the primal nothing, in that nothing can be said of the divine, as the divine is beyond all predication. Further, in that creation is the something, the divine remains, that no thing, that creates all some things, remaining transcendent to all some things, all created things. But the soul also has a connection to that divine nothing, in that the ground of the soul is just the inner divine life of the Trinity. Indeed, in the final stages of the mystical descent, the Trinity comes to dwell directly in the emptied abyss of the soul. And in further, in the sixth stage, as we'll discuss in a moment, of the aperture, the soul is constricted back through the Trinity into the ground of the Trinity itself, the divine paternal abyss, the Father, beyond all being, and yet the ground of all being, including the ground of being of the Trinity. Thus, the soul is also something in appearance only. In its ground, it is in fact the theater of that very void in which the divine eye perceives nothing other than its own no-thingness. And it's here, in this abyssal depth of the soul as pure ability, empty of will and intellect and reason, and empty of even love, the able nothingness becomes purely diaphanous, such that it does not see God, because there's nothing to see the divine, nor does God see it, because there's nothing left to see. Rather, in the moment of annihilation, the sixth stage, the divine sees nothing other than the divine. The soul briefly united with the only one that is, annihilation being the sole means of the true reality of God. Or, as Meister Eckhart would put it famously, distilling Marguerite Porete, the eye in which I see God is the same eye in which God sees me. The sixth step is one of utter brevity, opening only like an aperture, as Porete denotes it, in which the soul melts back into the singular divine reality, like a river running into the sea, or a clump of iron fused into the fiery nightmare of a furnace. Once the experience of the sixth stage occurs, as much as this can be described as an experience in any sense of that word, one soul only returns back to the fifth stage, and never lower. It's as if this is a transformational event, to use the language of Alain Badiou, that one must have fidelity to it, utterly transformed for all time. Of course, the soul can't endure in that sixth state for any sustained period of time. The aperture is just opened and closed. Indeed, access to that state is not even the result of human willing. It's the result of divine grace. Of course, it's not the result of human willing, because there is no human willing there. Thus, one who has achieved this soul will fall back into the fifth state, dwelling there during life until the aperture perhaps opens again, or one goes through the final seventh stage, which is physical death, the separation of the body and the soul. But recall that in that fifth state, the will is already wholly given over to the divine will. This state of personally will-lessness is what Porete will call the unencumbered soul, a state that seemingly is most alarming to the Inquisition. Given that the individual has basically been extinguished in state 5, the individual desires, wants, and needs of that individual, well, those are also extinguished. And thus all externals become objects of non-desire, we might say. Now, non-desire for riches, glory, fine foods, though those are all well enough. Such desires would have long been tempered in the mystical itinerary, maybe as far back as stage 1 or 2. But Porete goes much further. For her, the soul no longer seeks God through penitence, nor through any sacrament of the Holy Church, nor through thoughts, nor through words, nor through divine love, nor through even divine praise. Further, she writes that the soul seeks neither sermon, nor fast, nor prayer, and gives to nature all that is necessary, without remorse or conscience. Further, and I think even more dangerous still, Porete describes how most people do the contrary of their pleasures to attain the spiritual life. But the unencumbered soul, because such sensuality is just a non-desire, she says, the unencumbered ones do everything that pleases them. If they do not wish to lose their peace, since they have arrived in the state of freeness, that is, since they have fallen from the virtues into love, and love into nothingness. Now, these statements from chapters 85, from chapter 9, from chapter 90, and other places in the Mirror are very likely where the Inquisition zeroed in for their accusations of heresy, specifically antinomian heresy. I'll put the Latin and the English translations up on the screen of the three that we know of. Recall that William of Paris and his gang were able to diagnose 15 distinct passages as savoring of manifest heresy, as the technical language of the time described it. But only 3 such condemnations actually come down to us, none of which directly quote from the Mirror. However, from these 3, we do get some sense that the major concerns of the Inquisition were that the unencumbered soul no longer required mediation by the sacraments of the Church for salvation, that the soul was somehow untethered from pursuing normal moral virtue, and it no longer required the consolations of the divine, and could go on to pursue their desires without remorse or conscience. Now, taken out of context, Porete does say more or less this kind of thing. However, if you put all of that into the context of her mystical itinerary, such conditions only apply to someone at the 5th stage, and thus someone wholly given over to the divine will. Such an unencumbered soul wouldn't need the mediation of the Church or divine consolations, but nor would they seek out immoral pleasures or ill-gotten gains, precisely because their will and the divine will were submerged together. Of course, far be it from me to diagnose what is and is not heresy for the Catholic Church, but I do strongly suspect that her condemnation has much more to do with her specific historical circumstances than the actual contents of her book. Though I say that, but, Meister Eckhart only avoided excommunication because he died. However, I could definitely see how her teachings, taken out of context, could be taken as heretical, and worse, could be used to justify all manner of antinomian and immoral behavior by those claiming to be mystical adepts. Not that anyone would manipulate mystical texts to engage in immoral behavior. That's never happened. That would never, ever happen. However, as we come to the end of our exploration of Porete's mystical thought, I want to return to her final time in this world. As you may recall, Porete was condemned as contumacious in light of her refusal to acknowledge the Inquisition, to take its oaths, much less to undergo examination by William of Paris and his gang. For this, she was imprisoned under major excommunication and eventually deemed a relapsed heretic and then, of course, executed. And while her refusal to engage in her own prosecution by the Inquisition can be seen as a kind of, badass act of civil disobedience, I think something else is at work here as well. If we take the Mirror as an expression of Porete's own mystical journey, then we can only conclude that she herself has gone through all of the mystical itinerary laid out in that text, that she's speaking from experience. And thus, by the time of her arrest, she must have already been living in that 5th state, and at times perhaps even that 6th state of the mystical relationship with the divine. And in that 5th state, recall, Porete would have become the unencumbered soul, just unconcerned with the externalities that faced her, even the most dire externalities. In the depth of her soul, she was dwelling in Trinitarian communion with the divine. Thus, rather than being contumacious, I think we must imagine Marguerite Porete as simply being unencumbered. Freedom in prison, living and dying, orthodoxy and so-called heresy, they must have just meant nothing to her. Her silence being born out of anything other than stubbornness or protest, but from a serenity that results from being swallowed up in the divine abyss of love. The literature on Marguerite Porete has exploded since the mid-20th century recovery of the Mirror. The most accessible edition of the Mirror, with a fantastic introduction, remains that of Babinski in the Classics of Western Spirituality series. In fact, I would just suggest that you buy as many of those volumes of the Classics of Western Spirituality series as possible. You can get them for basically nothing secondhand. They are just a treasure of scholarship. Volume 3 of McGinn's masterpiece of the history of Christian mysticism, The Flowering of Mysticism, covers Porete along with other beguines with scholarly rigor and profound respect. I love how he covers these amazing mystics. A recent anthology by Brill, so yeah, those with any vows of poverty need not apply here. But this anthology by Stauffer and Terry is well worth having, and you should find it ever how you want to. If you're interested in the Beguines and you want to get a sort of introduction to them, Swan's book, The Wisdom of the Beguines, is a wonderful starting point. But now with these 4 mystical titans covered, I'll of course be coming back to more important, well, I won't say more important, but I do mean more important and to other important and lesser known mystics, especially the lady mystics, who don't get the attention they deserve, and by not covering them, I think that's to our own detriment. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.